First, I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar, Intellectual Freedom, Simple in Theory, Difficult in Practice. Just an FYI, per our past practice, we do record the webinars so that CAAL members who are not able to attend are able to view the recording later. So I have started the recording, just for full disclosure to everybody attending. I'd like to first start with our territorial acknowledgement. The Council of Atlantic University Library represents member libraries from across the region, all of whom sit on the unceded and traditional territories of First Peoples. In Newfoundland and Labradors, our libraries sit on the homelands of the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunavut, and the Innu of Nitassinan, the Beothuk, and the Mi'kmaq peoples. In Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia, we find our friends and colleagues situated on the territory of the Mi'kmaq. In New Brunswick, libraries are found on the land of the Wolastoqiyik, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy people. We at CAAL-CBPA wish to express our sincerest gratitude to the First Peoples who share their ancestral homelands with us all. And thank you all for coming. Just to give you a bit of a background of what we are seeing on the screen, you do control your audio. So if possible, we ask that you mute yourself during the presentation, or unless you wish to speak out loud, because otherwise we can hear background noise that interferes with the presentation. If you do not have a mic, or for some reason your audio is not working, you can, and I'm going to put it into the chat here, you can phone in for the audio portion using your telephone. I put the information in the chat, or you can type messages in the chat and I will relay them. I'm going to mute. Okay, there we go. So I'm muting those who are creating background noise, just in case you're wondering why you're suddenly being muted. For those who are phoning in, you can mute yourselves. If you don't have a mute button, you can mute yourself by pressing *6 on your phone, and *6 will unmute yourself. So just a reminder, we do have a code of conduct for our events. CAAL is dedicated to providing a positive event experience for all participants. We value your ideas, thoughts, and expression, and we expect attendees, speakers, and staff to show respect and courtesy toward one another. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Jim Turk. You should be able to see his video, and he will be sharing momentarily, he will be sharing his screen with us. Jim is a distinguished visiting scholar at Ryerson University and director of Ryerson's Center for Free Expression. From 1998 to June 2014, he served as executive director of the Canadian Association of University Teachers. Jim is a member of the board of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, a member of the steering committee of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, and a consultant to the American Association of University Professors Committee A on Academic Freedom and Tenure. He is also an adjunct research professor at the Institute of Political Economy at Carleton University. Today, Jim's going to speak to us about intellectual freedom. Libraries and universities are increasingly in the spotlight as our society struggles with the meaning and limits of freedom of expression and intellectual freedom. In this webinar, Dr. Turk will examine complex questions such as what do these concepts mean, where do they come from, why is freedom of expression recognized by the Canadian Charter as one of our 4 fundamental freedoms? What are the limits to these freedoms? What does hate speech mean in Canada? And does the regulation of speech help achieve social justice? Following the presentation, there will be time for Q&A. So I ask that while he is speaking, that you mute yourself. And then at the end of his presentation, we will open the floor to discussion and questions. So if you wish to go ahead, Jim, and you can share your screen at any time, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Just give me a second to find the PowerPoint here, which has disappeared. There it is. Give me 1 second, folks. Well, let me first begin by saying how delighted I am to be with you today, and I appreciate this opportunity to talk to you from around the country, or at least around the Atlantic provinces. Since Cynthia indicated, the title of the talk is Intellectual Freedom, Simple Theory, Difficult in Practice. I want to begin with 3 probably fairly obvious but important points that are the key to what I'm going to be talking about. The first is that intellectual freedom is a fundamental human right. You see in front of you a picture title of one of the most, sorry?
We're actually not seeing, we're seeing your screen, but not your slide deck. It's not moving. It
I
doesn't
didn't
seem
know,
to.
it's moved on mine. That's a big problem.
Sorry, because it was working earlier when we tried this.
I know.
Try unsharing and then share again just to see if that will work. Oh,
Okay.
so it just moved when you moved it there.
Okay, so let me try it here.
Okay,
Now,
there you go.
now,
Now it's working. Perfect.
now do you, is it okay
Yes,
now?
perfect.
Okay.
Yes.
So the first of the three fundamental points I want to make is that intellectual freedom is a fundamental human right. Liu Xiaobo is one of the great human rights defenders of the past century, a Chinese literary critic who spent most of his latter life in prison. He died in prison. His human rights work led him to be receiving the Nobel Prize. The Chinese government wouldn't release him out of prison to go receive the prize, and so the Nobel Committee, when they presented it, had an empty chair in the middle of the stage to represent him. When he talks about freedom of expression, he makes clear the link. He says, as you can see on the screen, free expression is the base of human rights, the root of human nature, and the mother of truth. To kill free speech is to insult human rights, to stifle human nature, and to suppress truth. The second point is that intellectual freedom is a core value for all libraries. I'll come back to that point in a minute. And the third is that censorship is an ineffective, often counterproductive way of remedying social problems. So in this talk, as Cynthia has indicated, I'm going to be covering several things. First, what do freedom of expression and intellectual freedom mean? Why does our Charter of Rights and Freedoms treat freedom of expression as one of Canada's 4 fundamental freedoms? Thirdly, why do libraries treat intellectual freedom as a core responsibility to support, defend, and promote? Fifth, what are the limits to these freedoms, and what does hate speech mean in Canada? And lastly, why is censorship not the answer, and why is the obvious next question rarely addressed? So let me begin with the meaning of intellectual freedom. In the library world, we use the term intellectual freedom. In most of the rest of the world, we use the term freedom of expression. They mean essentially the same thing. And the essence of that meaning is the right to express one's views, as well as to seek and receive information without interference. So it's the right to speak, but also the right to hear. We use the term freedom of expression rather than freedom of speech because expression can be more than speech. It can be oral, it can be in writing, it can be in the form of art, or through any other medium of one's choice. And finally, freedom of expression and intellectual freedom include freedom both with respect to the content of the expression and the manner of expression. It's so important that we understand that expression is not just about the content. One of the panels the Center for Free Expression put on, Johnny Williams, a distinguished African-American academic at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, who was suspended for some of his tweets about whiteness, spoke about how, as a Black American, I'm angry about the racism in our society. To tell me that I can say, oh, I'm unhappy about the racism, but I can't express that anger in my emotion, is denying a fundamental free expression right. And the concept of free expression, as we understand it, includes both. The base of our commitment to free expression really was articulated in a remarkable document adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. It's one of the great achievements of the United Nations. And it was a document that was adopted without a single country voting against it. And that's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And Article 19 of the Universal Declaration states quite unambiguously that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which you see in front of you, identifies freedom of expression as one of the 4 fundamental freedoms in Canada. Section 2B, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including the freedom of the press and other media of communication. The Canadian Federation of Library Association's statement on intellectual freedom also recognizes the importance of this. The CFLA recognizes and values, it says, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms as the guarantor of fundamental freedoms in Canada of conscience and religion, of thought, belief, opinion, expression, of peaceful assembly, and association. It goes on to articulate the library's responsibility, which is a core responsibility to safeguard and facilitate access to constitutionally protected expressions of knowledge, imagination, ideas, and opinion, including those which some individuals and groups consider unconventional, unpopular, or unacceptable. To this end, in accordance with their mandates and professional values and standards, libraries provide, defend, and promote equitable access to the widest possible variety of expressive content and resist calls for censorship and the adoption of systems that deny or restrict access to resources. Now, a key phrase in that statement is in accordance with their mandate. We're here in part because of the controversy that's arisen largely in the context of public libraries over their space rental practices. In recent years, and in this year too, there's a good deal of controversy about the tradition of public libraries making their space available in the same way they make all their other resources available to anyone in the community without discrimination, as long as the person using the space or the services is not going to engage in illegal behavior. For public libraries, the CFL statement describes their mandate, and the university libraries is different, which is why I'm mentioning this now, as rendering expressive content accessible and affordable to all. Libraries are essential gateways for all persons living in Canada to advance themselves through literacy, lifelong learning, social engagement, and cultural enrichment. University libraries have a more focused mandate, tied in with the mission of the university, which is the advancement of knowledge and the education of students. As one person who's reflected on the mission of university libraries, they've described it as the university library facilitates the identification and delivery of information regardless of format, in support of the university's teaching, research, and learning, guided by an ongoing assessment of the information needs of the user community. The issue of space rental for university libraries really doesn't come up in my experience, largely because the university has no obligation to rent space to anybody, quite unlike public libraries, which are a public space, and I would argue one of the last public spaces that are genuinely open to everyone, as so much public space has been privatized and after 9/11 securitized. Whereas universities are not public entities in that same way. Their mission is more particularly advancement of knowledge and education of students. So their obligations, the obligations of universities and of libraries, are to respect and uphold freedom of expression and academic freedom of academic staff in the fulfillment of that mission. I'll come back to that perhaps in the question period. So now, why does the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Canadian Federation of Library Associations treat intellectual freedom and freedom of expression as so essential? There are generally 3 reasons that are identified. One is self-realization. It's a fancy term for saying it's our ability to express ourselves and to hear feedback that lets us be who we are and lets us continue to change who we are. As young children, we have ideas, we express them, our parents or our friends either reinforce them or tell us they're stupid. We react as we choose. And that process is an ongoing iteration of our way of interacting socially. And it's vital. In the absence of our ability to express ourselves as happens in a totalitarian society, or in the absence of our ability to hear alternative voices, including ones we may find troubling or offensive, we don't have the ability to develop and become the people that we need to be. A second fundamental reason for the importance of intellectual freedom and free expression is democracy. Democracy is not so much the rule of law, but it's really about an ongoing public discussion, a public discourse about what's legitimate and what's not legitimate. And that discourse can never be shut down in the name of a majority at any one time. Yes, the majority can elect a government can pass laws, but we all have the right to challenge those laws. And if our right to question conventional wisdom, to challenge dominant views, is taken away, democracy cannot survive. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, in an academic environment, it's the advancement of knowledge. There are few things in many fields that are taken for granted today that weren't questioned, challenged, seen as unimaginable, seen as heretical, or otherwise discounted at an earlier point in history. We keep advancing because we have the ability to question, to challenge, to debate, to criticize. And that's the only route to the advancement of knowledge and the only way in which a university can fulfill its mission. So those are the three reasons behind the recognition of free expression as both a human right and as a fundamental civil liberty in our society. But there are limits to free expression. There's no such thing as absolute free expression. I'll just mention a few of the kinds of limits to free expression. In the criminal code, there isn't the freedom to engage in violent expression or threats of violence or hate speech or defamatory libel or counseling suicide or perjury or sedition or fraud, and the list could go on. In human rights law, in 3 provinces and 1 territory, in British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, there's hate speech provisions in the Human Rights Act, also in the Northwest Territories. They used to be in the Federal Human Rights Act, but it was taken out by Parliament in 2012 because it was felt that hate speech is such a serious matter, it should be dealt with under criminal law and under the criminal code rather than under human rights acts. And finally, we have limits on expression, even in municipal bylaws. Noise bylaws are a limit on expression. It says you actually don't have the freedom of expression to express yourself in a particularly high decibel way at 2 in the morning. So there are a variety of limits. Our charter recognizes that there can be limits. So while affirming freedom of expression and the other freedoms in the charter, Section 1 of the charter, however, says the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. Now, in order for a law constitutionally to limit a charter right like free expression, it has to pass certain tests or else it'll be ruled unconstitutional. The first test is that the law must meet a pressing and substantial need. So, for example, when the Canadian government passed a law restricting tobacco companies' advertising, it was challenged by the tobacco companies, and the government was able to make a case that the health consequences of smoking were so serious that this law was indeed meeting a pressing and substantial goal. And assuming it gets over that bar, any law to limit freedom of expression must be rationally connected to the law's purpose. So using the example of the limit on the tobacco companies, limiting the advertising on their packages and in the media was directly connected to the purpose of the law, which was to reduce the horrible health effects of smoking. And then thirdly, if it's past those 2 hurdles, it must also minimally impair the violated charter right, so that insofar as you want to restrict free expression and it's for a pressing and justifiable substantial reason, and the law is rationally connected, it has to impair that right as little as possible to achieve the objective. And then finally, after all those hurdles, anyone proposing the law must ensure or show that it's proportional to the law's purpose. In other words, the benefits from the law in restricting expression, whatever negative effects are produced, the benefits are greater than those negative effects. So there's a possibility to have limits, but it has to get through this fairly rigorous constitutional test before it can be allowed. The context in Canada generally with regard to the law and limits on free expression was articulated quite clearly by Chief Justice, or then Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin, who in a major decision, R versus Sharp in 2001, wrote on behalf of the court, among the most fundamental rights possessed by Canadians is freedom of expression. It makes possible our liberty, our creativity, and our democracy. It does this by protecting not only good and popular expression, but also unpopular or even offensive expression. The right to freedom of expression rests on the conviction that the best route to truth, individual flourishing, and peaceful coexistence in a heterogeneous society in which people hold divergent and conflicting views or beliefs lies in the free flow of ideas and images. If we do not like an idea or an image, we are free to argue against it or simply turn away. But absent some constitutionally adequate justification, we cannot forbid a person from expressing it. Because of the importance of the guarantee of free expression, any attempt to restrict the right must be subjected to the most careful scrutiny. And in judge speak, the phrase "the most careful scrutiny" means that one has to get over a very high bar before it's permissible to restrict expression. Libraries in the CFLA Statement on Intellectual Freedom reflect this too. I mean, as I was indicating earlier, in accordance with their mandates and professional values and standards, libraries provide, defend, and promote equitable access to the widest possible variety of expressive content and resist calls for censorship and the adoption of systems that deny or restrict access to resources. Libraries make their public spaces and services available to individuals and groups without discrimination. And it concludes, libraries have a core responsibility to safeguard and facilitate access to constitutionally protected expressions of knowledge, imagination, ideas, and opinion, including those which some individuals and groups consider unconventional, unpopular, or unacceptable. So the CFL Statement on Intellectual Freedom says the determination of what can be suppressed is what is not constitutionally protected. If it's constitutionally protected, then it's within the ambit of what we make available so people can hear, can criticize, can reject, can challenge, can protest, can affirm as they wish, but it's not our role to censor. The major limit that's of interest, I think, to most of us has to do with hate speech. And hate speech, as I said earlier, is dealt with in two places, in the Criminal Code of Canada and in the Human Rights Act of British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the Northwest Territories. With respect to the Criminal Code, there's two sections of the Criminal Code that spell out what hate speech is. The first is the one you see in front of you, 319.1, which says everyone who by communicating their statements in any public place, so that's the first requirement, it has to be in a public place, incites hatred against any identifiable group. That's the second. It has to be hatred against an identifiable group, where since incitement is likely to lead to a breach of the peace. So under this provision, it's only hate speech if it's a statement made in a public place, incites hatred against an identifiable group, and is likely to lead to a breach of the peace. Not as possibly or could or might, but is likely to lead to a breach of the peace. The second provision in the Criminal Code, 319.2, says everyone who, by communicating statements other than in private conversation, willfully promotes hatred against any identifiable group. So under 319.2, it's broader. It's not in a public place, but it's anywhere other than in private conversation. But the key phrase is willfully promotes hatred. Now, the problem as all of you probably know with laws, is what do these words actually mean? And it takes courts in dealing with specific cases to articulate what willfully promoting hatred means. Probably the best description of this generally is in a decision in the Nova Scotia Provincial Court by then Mr. Justice Jamie Campbell, who was dealing with a case involving two young people who had spray painted hate messages around Halifax and Dartmouth. And in his decision, he gives an explanation of how hate speech and hate crimes are to be understood under our criminal code. And he writes, hate crimes involve the promotion of hatred, not the expression or manifestation of it. Promotion in this context means actively supporting or instigating hatred. The Supreme Court of Canada has determined that promotion goes beyond encouragement. In other words, it's not a criminal act to encourage people to hate. An act of hatred or a hateful comment could act as an example or an encouragement to others by emboldening them. Promotion must go beyond uttering hate-filled comments. Now let's go to the Supreme Court. The key initial decision on hate speech was a case in 1990. It got to the Supreme Court in 1990. And it was around a person who had been a high school teacher in Eckville, Alberta, named Jim Keekstra, who was a virulent anti-Semite. And he taught anti-Semitic views in his class, and he required his students, if they were going to get good grades, to spew back his own anti-Semitic views. And he was fired properly. 2 years later, he was charged with hate speech, and his case made its way through the courts over 12 years and ended up in the Supreme Court. And then Chief Justice Dixon, writing for the majority in this decision, wrote as follows. As Justice Corey stated in R versus Andrews, which was a case earlier that year around hate speech, and I quote, hatred is not a word of casual connotation. To promote hatred is to instill detestation, enmity, ill will, and malevolence in another. Clearly, an expression must go a long way before it qualifies within the definition in section 319(2). And then he continues to try to clarify what the court means by hatred and what the law means by hatred. Hatred is predicated on destruction, and hatred against identifiable groups therefore thrives on insensitivity, bigotry, and destruction of both the target group and the values of our society. Hatred in this sense is the most extreme emotion that belies reason, an emotion that, if exercised against members of an identifiable group, implies that those individuals are to be despised, scorned, denied respect, and made subject to ill treatment on the basis of group affiliation. So that's the essence of what constitutes hate in our law, where members of an identifiable group, where the expression implies that those individuals are despised, scorned, denied respect, and made subject to ill treatment. Under human rights law, all the human rights acts that have a hate speech provision talk about publishing or issuing or displaying statements or publications or notices or signs, any representation that is likely to expose a person or a class of persons to hatred or contempt. But once again, that's what the law says. The question is, what do those words actually mean? Going back to one of the first human rights cases, Canada Human Rights Commission versus Taylor, again in 1990 before the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Dixon wrote, phrase hatred or contempt in the context of the Canadian Human Rights Act refers only to unusually strong and deep-felt emotions of detestation, calumny, and vilification. So again, but the problem is then that raises the question, what do we mean by detestation, calumny, and vilification? Well, the most recent case before the Supreme Court was in 2013, involving a Pentecostal preacher in Saskatchewan named William Watcott, who was, in my view, a disgusting homophobe who wrote routinely against the LGBTQ community. And in this case, he wrote four pamphlets, really homophobic pamphlets, was brought before the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission. And the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code had a little broader wording. It said that it prohibited publishing or displaying any representation that, in the words that you see in red in front of you, that exposes or tend to expose to hatred, ridicules, belittles, or otherwise affronts the dignity of any class, any person or class of persons on the basis of a prohibited ground. So it wasn't just exposure to hatred, but also to ridicule, belittling, or affronting the dignity of. He was charged for these 4 pamphlets and appeared before the Human Rights Tribunal that found him that all 4 pamphlets had violated the Human Rights Code of Saskatchewan. He appealed it to the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal that found that none of them did. Then that was appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada. And in the Supreme Court of Canada, which found that 2 of them did and 2 of them didn't, Mr. Justice Rothstein, writing on behalf of a unanimous court, gave us the most detailed explanation of what's hatred and what may be hateful. And I'd say 95% of what's called hate speech is hateful speech, but it's not hate speech as understood by the law. So Mr. Justice Rothstein gives, as I say, I think the clearest or most elaborate explanation. And he writes, the legislative term hatred or contempt must be interpreted as being restricted to those extreme manifestations of the emotion described by the words detestation and vilification. Expression that, in the words of the Saskatchewan Code, ridicules, belittles, or otherwise affronts the dignity of, does not rise to the level of ardent and extreme feelings constituting hatred required to uphold the constitutionality of a prohibition of expression in human rights legislation. Consequently, they are constitutionally invalid and must be struck from the code. In other words, he's saying it's hatred if it promotes detestation and vilification, but to include as well anything that ridicules, belittles, or otherwise affronts the dignity of broadens what would be proscribed so much and would interfere with freedom of expression that's so important to our democracy, to advancement of knowledge, to our development of ourselves, that it is unconstitutional. He then continues, in my view, detestation and vilification, and he's describing what they mean, aptly describe the harmful effect that the code seeks to eliminate. Representations that expose a target group to detestation, and remember, detestation was the words that were used both with regard to the criminal code previously and now with regard to human rights, tend to inspire enmity and extreme ill will against them, which goes beyond mere disdain or dislike. Representations vilifying, and he now clarifies that term, a person or group, will seek to abuse, denigrate, or delegitimize them, to render them lawless, dangerous, unworthy, or unacceptable in the eyes of the audience. Expression exposing vulnerable groups to detestation and vilification goes far beyond merely discrediting, humiliating, or offending the victims. So what we have in Canadian law is, on the one hand, a recognition that freedom of expression and intellectual freedom are so important to who we are and who we become as people, to democracy, and to the advancement of knowledge, that we only can restrict it using the law for those very extreme cases where essentially an individual as part of a protected group on a protected ground is deemed to be subhuman, is deemed to be, as he says here, lawless, dangerous, unworthy, or unacceptable in the eyes of the audience. In other words, extreme vilification. Now, my concluding comment is about censorship, because so much of the discussion about what people take to be hate speech is that it shouldn't be allowed. And what I've been talking about is what the law disallows. And the law disallows only, as I've been trying to say, extreme versions of the promotion of hatred. If it were simply the encouragement of hatred, Donald Trump would rightly be charged. And he should be charged with lots of things, but not under Canada's hate speech laws. But the thought is, let me just give you an example. Here at Ryerson, I was talking with a group of students, and they say, we shouldn't be exposed to racism on campus. It's unacceptable. And so many of the right-wing defenders of freedom of expression mock those students and say, "Oh, come on, get a life, get in the real world. Sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt you." Absolutely false. That, and we'll refer to them as snowflakes, or imply that they just don't have the wherewithal to survive in the real world. And that's fundamentally wrong. The students are right. They shouldn't be exposed to racism at Ryerson or anywhere else in our society. And we have a thoroughly racist society, so that's a challenge. The students are right to say they shouldn't be exposed to racism. Where I disagree with their demand to deplatform is that we don't deal with racism by censoring racist speech. I wish it were that simple. So let me go through just a few concluding points with regard to censorship and why I think I'm saying it's ineffective, counterproductive, as a way of remedying problems or promoting social justice. First of all, censorship can't begin to capture what it wants to prevent. It's always too broad or too narrow. Let me just give you an illustration. Henry Louis Gates Jr. is one of the leading African-American intellectuals in the United States. And he's written a good deal about freedom of expression. And he heads the African-American Study Center or Research Center at Harvard University. And the way he describes it, he said, if I'm talking with a group of other African-American students out in front of our building, and some white racist comes by and uses the N-word to describe us, we actually can cope with that. We know he's just a racist jerk. What's far more harmful is when one of their white friends comes by and says, I'm so happy to see all of you at Harvard. It makes it such a much richer and better place than it would be without you. And I'm so glad we have affirmative action traditions that allow folks like you to be here. Gates says, that's much harder to deal with. And you can't capture the daily microaggressions that all of us who are African American face, he says, by the criminal code, or else there'd be no speech that would be possible. There's so many ways in which racism can be expressed, or homophobia, or anti-Semitism, or Islamophobia, that if you think you're dealing with it just by dealing with limiting the N-word and a few other really horrible epithets, you're kidding yourself. And if you try to deal with it broadly by eliminating everything that is an expression of racism, you would so constrain freedom of expression that our democracy couldn't survive. Secondly, censorship doesn't really get rid of the racism or this anti-Semitism. It just drives it underground. It gets formulated in different ways, and sometimes in more virulent guises. Most of the European countries have far more rigorous hate speech laws than Canada, Britain, Germany, France. And yet there's not a shred of evidence, not a shred, that there's any less racism or homophobia or transphobia or anti-Semitism or Islamophobia in Europe than there is in Canada. Their strict hate speech laws simply do not eliminate the problem. What often happens when we try to censor expression is that it simply draws more attention to the person and the ideas. It often creates free speech martyrs in the public's mind. And people like Jordan Peterson play on that and benefit from that. Peterson talks about how his ability to raise at the peak $50,000 US a month in crowdfunding was made possible every time he had a speech canceled. It'd be big news, and the dollars would flow in. As well, there's a long history of how attempts to bring in speech codes or similar provisions often victimize those they are intended to help. The speech codes brought in American universities in the 1990s, all of which eventually were ruled unconstitutional, have a sorry track record while they were in operation. The anti-racist provisions in the University of Michigan code, the first 10 people charged were all blacks charged for making racist statements about whites. I mean, the list of examples of that sort, when Britain brought in its hate speech laws back in 1965, all of the initial charges were against black activists for anti-white racism, so-called. But censorship also denies the right to see and confront ideas and people. It diminishes our ability to develop critical analyses and awareness of what is essential for democratic discourse and decision making. In the controversy about Meghan Murphy at the Toronto Public Library, there was almost nothing in the press that provided a detailed critique of Meghan Murphy. Almost all of it was attacking Vickery Bowles, the city librarian. So our ability to see the nature of her ideas, which I find deeply troubling, and to criticize them and do a devastating critique of them, got overwhelmed by the focus on the controversy about whether she should be not allowed to rent the space. Next to the last, censorship raises a fundamental question. If we're going to go beyond if we're going to try to deal with it beyond what is dealt with in the law, who should have the authority to decide what everyone else can see and hear? Will pro-life activists who genuinely believe that abortion is murder have the right to silence people like me who are pro-choice? Or can pro-choice people silence pro-life folks whose displays and so on I find personally disgusting? We just go, I mean, I can use hundreds of examples of where even within marginalized groups, there's differences among who gets to decide. There's not a good answer to that question. And lastly, by giving the illusion of effective action, it diverts from real solutions. I mean, if we think that by censoring racist speech, we're eliminating racism, we're not only deluding ourselves, but we're diverting attention from what we do need to do to eliminate racism. And in my first list of questions, I said, talking about why censorship doesn't work, avoids us dealing, we typically don't ask the next question. Well, if we say the law and rules should not be used to solve these problems unless they get over a high bar, doesn't mean, as the right often leaves it, well, that's the end of the discussion. In fact, it opens up a far more important discussion. If we're going to deal with transphobia, which is rampant in our society, with racism, which is rampant in our society, then how do we address that? And if we're going to deal with racism, we have to deal with our fundamentally flawed criminal justice system, the serious economic inequality, and other things that are horrendously complicated and difficult to deal with, but are the only solution. And by thinking that censoring speech of people who speak in libraries, or not letting library facilities, or not having certain things in your collection are going to solve this problem, I think is simply wrong. I'll stop there. If after, I'm looking forward to the discussion and questions, whether respectful or not, I must say, Cynthia, I believe in intellectual freedom, so that's okay. But if you have any questions afterward or would like to discuss any issues or want any of the references to the material I've talked about, please feel free to contact me. There's my email address and my Twitter handle, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Turk. It's an interesting background on the law, the criminal code, and the human rights charter, which I hadn't actually gone that deeply into. Now we come to the part of our presentation or the webinar when you, the attendees, get the chance to talk to Dr. Turk or talk amongst each other and really discuss the topic of hand, the intellectual freedom and hate speech. So we're going to do this in an organized fashion in terms of we don't want to speak over each other. So if somebody else is speaking, I will moderate. So if somebody goes on for too long, I will respectfully cut you off because we do want to make sure that as many people as possible get the opportunity to to participate in the discussion. So you can either unmute yourself to speak and ask your question or express your thought, or you could type it in the chat and I will relay it depending on whether you have access to a mic or not. I don't know who wishes to go first, so if somebody wishes to open up the floor. Please feel free to unmute yourself or type your question or comment in the chat. I know we had quite a few comments. Oh, sure. I think I hear somebody. Oh,
you heard me.
okay, so we do have a question.
Do you have somebody with a question? I was going to say that's one of the problems of somebody talking at you for so long, but we can't have a webinar on intellectual freedom without some tough questions and discussion. So
sure. So we do have a question in the chat from Lindsay. How do you reconcile the ideal of freedom of expression with societal inequalities that work to silence vulnerable populations, thus making the reality of freedom of expression inequitable?
Freedom of expression, like most of our other freedoms, has always been inequitable in the sense that those who are privileged, those who are wealthy, those who are white, whether it's economic inequality or expressive freedom, have no trouble having their voices heard. And one of the reasons that I feel constitutional protection of freedom of expression is so vital is to try to right that balance. Rich, white, wealthy men in our society don't need constitutional protections to have their voices heard. It's those who are marginalized. It prevents a majority at any one time. And just look at what's happening in Trump's America right now, that silences marginal voices. And in another talk at another time, I would be happy to trace through the history of how constitutional protections for free expression have been vital to marginalized groups in trying to challenge, overturn the dominant repressive nature of the majoritarian society. There's a new book I just could mention, given your librarians, by Timothy Scheel called African Americans in the First Amendment, The Case for Liberty and Equality, which was just published by SUNY, State University of New York Press, which traces the history of the African American civil rights movement in the United States' reliance and benefit from the First Amendment protections.
Did that answer your question, Lindsay? So for Lindsay, that she doesn't think that quite answered her question. So I don't know, is there any specifics that you're wanting to focus on, Lindsay? And you can feel free to open up, unmute yourself and speak. Oh, I'm not sure I'm hearing anybody. So while we wait for Lindsay to respond, there were some questions that folks. No. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead. There we go. Oh. There we go. I think Lindsay was trying to speak, but it created some feedback. That's no problem, Lindsay. That can happen.
Well, hopefully while Lindsay's writing to you, let me just elaborate what I was trying to say. What I was trying to say is the fundamental issue that we're trying to deal with, or many of us are trying to deal with, and I assume Lindsay is the inequality in our society, which we see. I mean, as I was saying earlier, we live in a racist society. We live in a transphobic society. We live in a homophobic society. And how do we deal with that? And what I'm saying is using the law around free expression to solve those problems should be reserved for extreme manifestations because of the broader value of free expression to every other aspect of our lives. And that protection in law primarily benefits marginalized groups. But the debate really isn't around censorship or non-censorship. The debate should be around what do we do to get rid of racism? And censorship isn't the answer. If that's not the answer, we should be talking about what is the answer and what are we going to do about that. And I just find it deceptively easy to believe that we're doing something useful when we deplatform someone, rather than when we take on the much harder problem of how do we fix our fundamentally flawed criminal justice system? How do we deal with the massive inequality in our society and so forth?
So I'm wondering, Lindsay, if you want to try that one more time, and it might be, Jim, if you mute yourself while she's talking, if both of us do, because I think we're the only ones unmuted.
Okay,
That
just a minute.
might help with Lindsay trying to turn her. Go ahead, Lindsay. Okay, if you want to try to type that into the chat, or if there's, or if you want to try calling into the meeting, that might be the better way for you to be able to speak verbally. And I apologize for the, I'm not quite sure what's causing the feedback. In the meantime, we did have some folks who had specific questions or things that they want to learn out of the webinar or get out of the webinar when they RSVP'd. And so I thought I would move to some of those questions. So Rebecca had a question about how to address freedom of expression within library policies, events, etc. So you can unmute yourself, Jim. There you go.
I mean, I think that's what the CFLA Statement on Intellectual Freedom tries to do, is to spell out in some detail of what intellectual freedom means for libraries and what are the implications. I'm not sure what the question's asking beyond what I think's in the CFLA Statement on Intellectual Freedom.
Okay, so I'm not sure, Rebecca, if that was an answer to your question. I know you're on the in the meeting, and if you want to unmute and follow up on that question. I guess one question that I think has come up in the RSVPs questions was the idea that how can we have those conversations to create to address transphobia, racism? What are the ways that those can be dealt with, if not in terms of censorship, but in terms of how can we advance those discussions?
Well, I mean, certainly in talks I give to public libraries, I say, well, while I think you have an obligation, as long as she's not going to engage in illegal behavior, to allow people who like Megan Murphy to speak. You allow her to rent space, but the library itself should be listening to the community. And clearly, transphobia and the experience of trans women and trans men is difficult. They're subjected to violence. That should be made the subject of library-sponsored fora to talk about that issue and bring in trans activists to talk about what do we do to eliminate that. I mean, we have problems in many cities with the police routinely beating up trans people with the kind of violence they face. We need to have public discussions about how to do something about that, and the library should be sponsoring those kinds of things. If there's material in its collections that address those issues that it doesn't have, it should expand its collection. There's a whole variety of tools that libraries have to do that. In the university context, insofar as the librarians have some influence on what should be added to the collection, as they do, to try to encourage building up the collection that deals with some of these issues.
Thank you. So we had a question from Denise, which I think is a follow-up to the MSVU question. Given that privileged groups often have many channels for their message, do we really think that libraries are censoring them by not providing spaces for their message? It begs the question, what is censorship?
Well, I mean, I simply disagree. The role of libraries are to be open to all without discrimination. When somebody comes to a public library to get a library card, whether they're a racist or anti-racist activist, whether they're homeless or a millionaire, they have access to a library card. They have access to the resources of the library. The library prides itself in being a public space open to all. That's what welcoming. It doesn't, welcoming and inclusive does not mean that you're not going to come across content that you might find offensive. There's all sorts of things I find offensive that are in every library collection in the country. There's all sorts of people who speak at libraries that I find offensive. And that's true of everybody. If libraries get in the business of saying, well, we're going to let some speak and not others, who are they to decide? On what grounds do they decide? And to treat marginalized groups as if they're monolithic is simply wrong. When one looks at some of the, I mean, as soon as you start censoring, you start having to make decisions that privileges some people and not others. And who are you as a library to make those decisions?
So Lindsay had a follow-up to her original point. My question was more in regards to the inequality inherent in a group of marginalized people having to defend their existence, which is far greater effort and offers far more potential harm than a bigoted person making a hateful speech. This is an inherently inequitable relationship.
It is indeed inherently, but the challenge that marginalized groups have always faced is how to overcome the inequality to which they're being exposed by the majority in the society. And the question that libraries have to deal with, as the rest of us have to deal with, is what can we do to amplify their voices? Free expression is really important for all the reasons I talked about. So instead of focusing on how we try to silence the voices that we think are harmful, which never works in any case. I mean, it's not as if censoring or hate speech laws work to achieve the objective. I mean, that's the premise in the question. It doesn't work. So what does work is finding ways to amplify, and if you look at some of the advances that have been made, I mean, you look at gains made by the LGBT community, a lot of that's been possible because of their free expression rights. I repeat again, powerful, privileged people don't need constitutional protections for their expression rights. Marginalized people do, because they're always vulnerable to the views of the majority. And in our society, I would hate to see the result of a referendum as to whether the majority were supportive of trans rights or whether the majority were anti-racist. I don't think they are. So I'm very leery about giving up constitutional protections because it seems to afford some ability to silence someone when in fact we know that silencing isn't a way to deal with the problem in the first place.
So Lindsay had a follow-up point. I would like to make the point that providing access is not the same as providing a platform.
Well, it's important to distinguish, and this is an issue for public libraries, I think, more than university libraries. I'm not sure if university libraries rent their space to outsiders. So any program that speakers at a university library are presumably speakers that are either brought in by the academic staff for their academic purposes, which is protected by academic freedom, or are speakers that the library has chosen to have there. The issue comes up more with regard to space rental, which needs to be clearly distinguished and is not clearly distinguished in the public's mind between a program the library is putting on and the library simply saying, well, we're prepared to make space available if you want to have an event or whatever. So Megan Murphy renting a space is quite different from Megan Murphy being on a library-sponsored program. And all libraries have selection criteria, and presumably Megan Murphy wouldn't meet the selection criteria to be on a library-sponsored program. There's just a big difference. And universities rent space to make money. And a lot of people want to rent it because they think, I spoke at Dalhousie University, when all they did was rent a room there like they could have rented at a hotel. We have to help the public understand that those cases of space rental are not endorsed by or anything other than simply using a room.
So MSVU was basically saying to earlier in the presentation, Jim, you mentioned that universities don't have an obligation to provide space/platforms. They have a different role or degree of public responsibility than, say, public libraries. And she was just asking if you could clarify, when possible, whether you're speaking of the public or the university context when you're in some of your answers. Because
Well, no, what I'm trying to distinguish is the role of a public library is different than the role of the university.
okay,
Okay, public libraries are set up under provincial library acts, and as such, they are under the charter. So the library values say our resources are, a public library values our resources are available to everybody. But in addition, should they try to restrict access to their, whether it be a library card or use of their public spaces on a ground based on, virtually any of the grounds we've been talking about, they'd be in violation of the charter.
okay,
Universities are in a different setting. Their mission is not a public mission in the same sense. It's a social mission to educate students and advance knowledge. And it's a different context where freedom of expression is vital for the advancement of knowledge, but the issues of space rental and so on don't come up in regard to university libraries.
So I know that we've hit the slightly gone past our time, but I did one last question from Kim Mears, and I think this is trying to speak to the point that that is being discussed in the chat. Is that in the example of Vancouver Public Library and Megan Murphy, at what point does her opinion become hate speech? Is transphobia hate speech?
Okay, so the courts have been very clear that racism in its, I mean, they haven't talked about transphobia, they have talked about racism. Racism in itself is not hate speech. Hate speech, and that's where if you go back and look at the slides that I showed, I mean, basically, hate is the willful promotion. Hate speech has to be the willful promotion of hatred against an identifiable group. And hatred, in turn, is understood by the courts to mean vilification and detestation, portraying people who are in that category, in this case, people who are trans, as being less than human, as worthy of being abused, delegitimated, and so forth in a society. I mean, portraying them as subhuman, essentially. That's what's hate speech. Saying you disagree with them and so on may be hateful, but it is dealt with by means other than the law. It's dealt with by exposing them, criticizing them, showing what's wrong and what's harmful about what they have to say. There's a whole variety of social actions we can take, but it's not illegal.
Okay, and we had one last, it was a follow-up to Kim's. So basically it was that, sorry, for some reason this thing is putting things in front. So to go off of what Kim said, Megan Murphy's group knew that there would be protests. They explicitly told the TPL that security police would be required for the event, knowing that something could potentially encourage protests. Uh, would that make it into hate speech?
Absolutely not. Uh, I've and others have engaged in a variety of things that have caused counter protests. I mean, protest is one of the wonderful things that's possible because of our freedom of expression laws. When we find things that we are deeply offensive, we protest. I can't count the number of protests I've been at in front of the American consulate in Toronto over their foreign policy on various things, or their disregard of human rights in various countries. So the fact that something evokes protest is by no means makes it hate speech. It simply means that you're exercising your free expression right as a way of dealing with speech you don't like. But again, I repeat, we have all this discussion about censorship or non-censorship. What we really need, and libraries can play a big role in helping this, is move on to a discussion of what would really solve some of these social problems and help achieve social justice. And that isn't censorship. It's far more difficult things that we need to turn our mind to.
Okay, so there was, I know we've gone past time, 2:05, and I understand if folks have to leave. Just one last question that MSVU had following up on what you had said. They were wondering if you could let the attendees know whether you do see some distinctions between intellectual freedom and freedom of expression, different groups of university employees versus university teaching faculty, researchers, for instance.
Okay, that's a really important question. I think freedom of expression and intellectual freedom refer to the same thing. They're vocabulary that are differently used in different places. The distinction is really between either of those and academic freedom, which is fundamentally different. Academic freedom in the university refers to a right that academic staff have and need in order to do their jobs of educating students and advancing knowledge. And it's actually more restrictive than freedom of expression. So while I have the freedom of expression rights to stand in the middle of the campus or to give a talk on the steps of a campus, claiming that creationism is the proper understanding of how we all came to be here and the dinosaurs and humans coexisted 6,000 years ago. If I'm teaching first-year biology, I don't have the right to do that. Academic freedom is constrained by disciplinary norms, by our knowledge of fields. So if you're an astronomer, you can't teach astrology as if it were science, and so forth. So academic freedom is a right that faculty and academic staff and librarians have to do their jobs, but it's within some broader boundaries of disciplinary norms, which themselves are often contested, and rightly so. Whereas freedom of expression is a broader, more expansive right. So I don't have free expressive rights when I'm in the classroom to say whatever the heck I want. And if I'm teaching organic chemistry, I can't teach Hamlet all year. I mean, there's all sorts of restrictions in the classroom context under academic freedom. So there is a distinction there, but intellectual freedom and freedom of expression are essentially the same thing.
Well, thank you, Jim. We're past time, so I want to respect as much as possible everybody's time. But this has been an interesting discussion, and it will be. Like I said, it has been exiting. Oh, it has been recorded, so I will be putting that up as soon as possible. And I want to thank you very much, Dr. Turk, for for entertaining all of these questions and providing us some background on the legal framework around intellectual freedom, freedom of speech. It's given us some food for thought, and it's something that we could take back within CAAL within our institutions to see how we could move forward in this particular area.
Well, I want to thank you in turn and the council for inviting me to do this. It's so important that we have these discussions, and it's so important the discussions go beyond this so that each of your member libraries find opportunities to have this discussion with their own staff and with their communities, because these are fundamentally difficult and important questions that have to be dealt with. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with all of you.
And just to remind everybody, we're actually next Tuesday on the 18th having our forum on equity, diversity, and inclusion. So this could be this is a very good springboard into that further discussion at our forum next week. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.